I'm 40, and these mistakes have ruined my life. This story will help you avoid these mistakes.
For a long time, it seemed to me that I was doing everything right. Not perfectly and not without mistakes, but logically and consistently. I lived the way, in my opinion, an adult should live. I took responsibility, thought ahead, kept everything under control and did not allow myself to fall apart because of emotions. I was sure that this is how a stable life is built. I got used to relying only on myself early on. I felt calmer that way. When the decision is in my hands, I clearly understand what I am responsible for and what will happen next. I did not avoid problems, I simply closed them. Quickly, rationally, without unnecessary conversations. At that time, this seemed to me a sign of maturity, because the result was more important than the process. I believed that stability was the main thing that I could give to my family. And if it required taking on more, I took it. I did not complain, did not shift responsibility, did not run away. I simply did what I thought was right. It seemed to me that when one person held everything together, it became easier for others to breathe. In the family, this seemed normal for a long time. I was not absent and did not live a separate life. I was nearby, but almost always a little ahead. I determined the direction, pace, and priorities. If there were doubts or objections, I listened to them, but the decision still remained mine. Not out of a desire to dominate, but out of the conviction that it was faster and more reliable. At that time, I did not notice an important thing. When one person constantly makes decisions, others gradually stop investing in them. This does not happen abruptly and is not accompanied by scandals. People simply get used to the fact that their participation does not change anything, and over time they begin to withdraw internally. I perceived this as a convenience, not realizing that I was losing touch. It seemed to me that I was making life easier. That I was relieving tension by taking responsibility. I sincerely believed that this was a form of care, because in my mind, care looked like efficiency. I did not distinguish between care and control, although the difference between them is huge. Care leaves room for the other person, while control gradually takes it away. I did not notice how the space for discussion disappeared. Not dramatically, but in small things. In the fact that decisions began to be perceived as a given. In the fact that answers became shorter. In the fact that the phrase, "whatever you say," began to sound more often than, "let's think together." At that time it did not seem like a problem, because there was less resistance, and therefore, it seemed to become calmer. I lived in a mode of constant must. We must work more, we must stay the course, we must not shake the system. There was no room for pauses in this logic, because a pause meant doubt. I did not stop not because I did not want to hear, but because I did not see the need for it. It seemed to me that feelings were something that would level out on their own when everything else was stable. Now I understand how wrong that was. Logic can organize life, but it doesn't maintain intimacy. When I relied only on rationality, I gradually lost the sense of what was happening next to my loved ones. But then I was sure that logic would withstand everything, and it was this confidence that became the main trap. I was not rigid and I was not indifferent, but I was too focused on the result and too little on live contact. I did not yet understand that where decisions are always made by one person, the feeling of togetherness gradually disappears. I perceived the calmness that kept me in control as a solid foundation, not noticing that tension was already accumulating under it. It was from that moment that everything began to slowly change. Not loudly and not abruptly, but in such a way that it was easy to miss. I began to notice the silence and perceive it as a relief, not realizing that it had a completely different meaning. The changes began not with events, but with feelings. Life remained stable on the outside, and that is why I did not pay attention to what was happening between us for a long time. Work was going well, life was well established, there were no serious conflicts. This created the illusion that there was no reason for anxiety. Conversations became different. They did not disappear, but they lost their depth. I listened, but more and more often I caught myself formulating an answer before the other person finished speaking. At that moment, I listened not to understand, but to quickly close the conversation. This meant that it was more important for me to maintain my position than to maintain contact. At the time, I perceived this as calm and self-control. It seemed to me that I had learned not to give in to emotions. Now I see that this was a form of distancing. I began to protect myself from difficult topics, calling it rationality. I didn't realize that I was distancing myself from a live dialogue. The house gradually became quieter. Arguments became less frequent, tension seemed to disappear, and everyday life worked smoothly. I took this as a positive sign and proof that everything had stabilized. I didn't understand that the absence of conflicts didn't always mean the absence of problems. Often it means that a person simply stopped believing that they would be heard. Decisions were made faster and faster. I would say how things would be better, and I would hear agreement in response. It wasn't active or interested, but it was enough to move on. I didn't notice that behind this agreement was not trust, but fatigue. When a person gets tired of fighting for their position, they stop investing, and it only looks like convenience at first glance. There was a constant tension inside me, but I didn't call it that. I called it focus and responsibility. It seemed to me that now was not the time for difficult conversations and doubts, that important topics could be discussed later, when it would be easier. This later was very convenient, because it allowed me not to touch on something that could change my lifestyle. Gradually, I began to confuse stability with stagnation. The days became similar to each other, without sharp changes and without strong emotions. In this monotony, I did not notice how the feeling of closeness disappeared. We were physically close, but emotionally we were less and less often in the same space. I noticed that it was not the problem itself that annoyed me, but the need to discuss it. I wanted everything to remain simple and understandable, without complicated explanations. I did not realize that the desire for this simplicity gradually cut me off from my loved ones, because live contact is always more difficult than ready-made solutions. The same signs appeared in my relations with my children. They became more reserved and rarely shared trifles. I explained it as growing up and didn't ask myself why there was a distance between us that hadn't existed before. I was sure that I had the situation under control, but in reality I had simply stopped feeling it. The most dangerous thing about this state was the lack of clear alarm signals. No one was shouting, giving ultimatums, or demanding change. The tension disappeared, and with it the connection began to disappear. Now I understand that the moment when it becomes too quiet rarely means stability. More often it means that people stop investing in their life together. At the time, I took this silence as evidence that everything was falling into place. I didn't notice that during this period, something important had already begun to leave my life without noise and without warning. It was this invisibility that made the following events inevitable. For a while, it seemed to me that all these were just background changes. That the tension would pass by itself, that it was worth keeping up the pace a little longer, and life would level out again. I did not expect a catastrophe, because I did not feel that it was coming. I expected relief, not realizing that the direction had changed a long time ago. The first to fall apart were not relationships, but my ability to maintain a familiar rhythm. What had previously seemed like a normal load began to exhaust me. Work, which gave a sense of control and significance, ceased to compensate for the inner emptiness. I increasingly found myself unable to concentrate, that any little thing irritated me more than before, and rest did not restore me. At that time, I did not yet connect this with what was happening at home. It seemed to me that the reason was solely in fatigue or external circumstances. It was a convenient thought, because it did not require me to change anything in my behavior. I didn't see that my psyche had been signaling overload for a long time, and I stubbornly called it temporary difficulties. Tension in the relationship didn't appear right away either. On the contrary, everything looked even calmer from the outside. We talked less, argued less, and rarely touched on difficult topics. I took this as evidence that the conflicts had run out. Only over time did it become clear that it wasn't the tension that had run out, but the willingness to change something. At one point, I felt for the first time that I was losing my footing. Not abruptly or dramatically, but because of small things. Decisions that had previously been made together began to happen without me. I would learn about them after the fact and catch myself with a strange feeling, as if I had fallen out of the process. At that time, I still thought it was a coincidence, not realizing that it was a direct consequence of how I had spent years building a system where my voice was decisive. It was during this period that I first truly felt fear. Not the fear of losing something specific, but the fear of losing control. And instead of stopping and seeing what was really happening, I did what I always did. I tried to hold everything in my hands even more tightly. Work more, plan more, listen less. This did not stop the process. It accelerated it. Gradually, I felt like I was not being heard, just as I had not heard others before. The conversations that did happen were formal and brief. They did not lead to either intimacy or change. I began to feel superfluous in my own life, although until recently I was sure that everything depended on me. Work stopped saving me. It no longer gave me a sense of meaning, but only took away the last remnants of energy. I caught myself thinking that I was using it as a way to not return home emotionally, even when I was physically near. This was the moment when I first admitted that I was running away, although for a long time I had convinced myself otherwise. My mental state began to change more noticeably. I had trouble sleeping, constant tension in my body, and a feeling of anxiety for no apparent reason. I tried to ignore these signals, because in my worldview, strong people don't stop because of such things. Now I understand that it was this belief that made the situation critical. The collapse didn't happen in one day. There wasn't one decision or one event after which everything ended. It was the accumulated result of dozens of small moments in which I chose control over contact, silence over conversation, and logic over a living feeling. When the consequences became obvious, there was no point in rewinding. I found myself at a point where I had to take an honest look at what I had created with my own hands for the first time. And the hardest part was realizing that the catastrophe didn't come from outside. It grew inside the life I thought was right. It was then that I realized that the silence that I had perceived as stability for so long was a warning. I just learned not to hear it. After everything became obvious, there was no relief. There was no feeling that it couldn't get any worse or that now you could pull yourself together and move on. On the contrary, there was a strange and exhausting state in which you seemed to be living, but you didn't feel like you were inside your own life. I woke up with a feeling of tension even before I realized where I was. My body was on constant alert, as if something was about to happen, although there was no real threat. Sleep stopped restoring, thoughts did not stop, and any silence caused not peace, but anxiety. Then I realized for the first time that the psyche does not turn off on command and does not obey logic in the way I used to think. For a long time I did not admit that there was something seriously wrong with me. It seemed to me that it was just a reaction to stress and that it was worth enduring a little, and everything would return to normal. But the more I tried to ignore my condition, the stronger it manifested itself. This was the moment when it became clear that endurance no longer worked as a tool, but only deepened the problem. Gradually, things appeared that I had previously considered unacceptable for myself. Medication, counseling, regular attempts to understand what was happening to me. I perceived this as a defeat, because for many years I had built an image of a person who could cope on my own. Only over time did I realize that asking for help does not mean weakness, but rather a recognition of the limits of my own resources. The most difficult thing was to realize that some of the consequences could not be quickly corrected. My relationship with my children changed, and this was felt even in the smallest things. I saw that they were more cautious, more reserved, as if they were keeping their distance. I could not blame them for this, because I understood that this distance did not appear suddenly. It was formed over the years, while I was busy with other priorities. With the woman with whom I once had a family, we began to communicate differently. Without open hostility, but also without closeness. It was a cold and even contact, in which everyone kept their boundaries. I realized that many conversations should have taken place much earlier, and now they could no longer change the past. This understanding was painful, but important, because it showed that not all problems are solved when you are ready for them. During this period, I thought a lot about how I got here. And the most unpleasant thing was not the realization of the mistakes themselves, but the realization that most of them seemed completely rational at the time. I had not done anything blatantly wrong. I had simply ignored small signals for a long time, considering them unimportant. That is what made the situation so profound. Gradually it became clear that I was not living in the crisis, but in its consequences. This meant that there were no quick solutions anymore. You cannot restore trust, peace, or a sense of closeness with one right step. You can only stop making the situation worse and start acting differently, accepting the limitations you now have to live with. This state taught me an important thing. If you don't stop when the first crack appears, the stop will come later and much more severely. The psyche does not punish or take revenge, it simply stops pulling what it can no longer bear. And then you have to deal not with the choice, but with the consequences. I can't say that at this stage everything began to improve. Rather, I learned to look at my condition without illusions. I realized that recovery is not a return to the old life, but building a new one within much narrower limits. And only from this realization did the opportunity arise to move on, without deceiving myself. It was in this state that I first thought not about how to fix everything, but about how to live in such a way as to no longer destroy either myself or those around me. I was looking for a moment for a long time when everything would start to improve. I was waiting for some internal point after which it would become easier to breathe, think, live. But over time, I came to understand that such a moment does not exist. There is only a state in which you either continue to worsen the situation or stop doing it. The first real change was not a decision, but an admission. I stopped convincing myself that I would someday turn everything back. I accepted that part of my life was left behind without the possibility of repeating it. It was painful, but this is what relieved the constant internal tension. When you stop living in anticipation of the return of the past, space appears for the present. I began to look at responsibility differently. Before, for me, it meant control and management. Now responsibility began to mean attentiveness to the boundaries, my own and those of others. I learned to stop before the need to prove something arises. It did not look like strength, but this is what gradually returned my sense of reality. Relationships with children did not resume immediately. I realized that trust cannot be regained with words or the right actions done once. It only comes back through repeated presence without pressure. I stopped demanding intimacy and allowed it to develop at the pace they were ready for. This meant accepting distance and not perceiving it as punishment. With the woman with whom I once had a family, our contact remained difficult. I no longer tried to explain myself or prove that I was different now. I realized that changes do not require arguments. They are either noticeable over time or they are not there. My task was not to restore the relationship, but to never repeat the same mistakes again in any form. I began to relate to work differently. It was no longer a refuge from life. I no longer used being busy as a way not to feel. This did not mean that work became less important, but it was no longer the only support. I learned to notice when escape under the guise of responsibility tries to take its place again. The most important thing became the ability to stay in conversations that I previously considered unnecessary. I stopped listening to respond and began to listen to understand, even when it caused discomfort. I accepted that contact is always more difficult than control, but that is where life lies. This did not give instant results, but gradually changed the very quality of my presence with others. The problem with which I came to this point did not disappear completely. It does not disappear with a solution or awareness. It remains a background that requires constant attention. The only difference is that now I see it and do not call it the norm. I learned to notice the first signs that I am again trying to solve everything myself and again ignoring live contact. If I had known this earlier, much in my life would have turned out differently. But knowledge comes not when it could save, but when it already has to be paid. And that is what makes them valuable. Not to justify the past, but to avoid destroying what can still be saved. I did not become perfect and did not get rid of all the consequences. I simply stopped living as if the price of decisions did not matter. And this turned out to be enough to feel like I was not a function, a role, or a set of responsibilities again, but a person who is learning to live more attentively. This is not a story about recovery. This is a story about how to not finish yourself off. And if someone, having heard this, stops a little earlier than life stopped me, then it all made sense. Breaking myself turned out to be more difficult than breaking circumstances. I had to give up the idea that I always know what is right and allow others to have their voice without having to correct it. When I stopped defending my own ideals as the only truth and began to look wider, many things suddenly became clearer. I saw that change does not begin with the right decisions, it begins with the willingness to stop being right. It was from that moment that I felt that it was getting easier for me. Not because life became easier, but because I stopped fighting with it and with those around me. And now I know, moving forward does not begin when you try to change everything around you, but when you allow yourself to change.